The story of Lee is not one of arrival, but of emergence. At 7 years old, Lee did not pass through airport gates or present documents at a border. Lee came to America inside a metal box. For 52 hours, Lee existed in total darkness, curled beside a stranger who whispered, "Don't make a sound." Today, Lee is an immigration paralegal in a bustling legal aid office, the person others turn to when the system feels impossible. But the child who arrived without a name still lives inside the adult, who fights for names every day. This episode traces the invisible line between undocumented childhood and the fragile legality of adulthood, revealing how identity is not given, but forged in the spaces between paperwork and memory. Lee's earliest memories are of a bustling port city in East Asia, where towering cranes moved shipping containers like toys and the air tasted of salt and diesel. Lee's mother was a seamstress in a garment factory, working 14-hour days to stitch clothing for Western brands. Their home was a single room above a noodle shop, the walls thin enough to hear the cook's radio through the night. Life was a careful equation of survival, but Lee's mother had a fierce dream her child would receive a real education. When the factory owner fled with months of unpaid wages, that dream evaporated. The debt collector's knocks grew louder, more violent. The choice became clear: stay and risk everything, or send the child ahead. Lee's mother sold her sewing machine, her gold wedding band, and borrowed from loan sharks to pay a smuggler $8,000. The plan was simple: hide Lee inside a shipping container bound for Los Angeles, where a distant cousin waited. Lee was told it would be a short trip. "Like a long sleep," the smuggler said. The container was a standard 40-foot steel unit, one among thousands on the massive ship. Inside, it was not empty. 15 other people huddled in the darkness, their breathing shallow with fear. The only light came from a single cell phone, used sparingly. The air grew thick and foul within hours. There was a bucket for waste. A few liters of water were shared between them all. Lee remembers the sound most: the deep, groaning hum of the ship's engine vibrating through the metal walls, the crash of waves against the hull, and the terrifying silence when the engine occasionally stopped. Someone sobbed quietly in the dark. Another person prayed. Lee clung to a small cloth doll, focusing on the feel of the fabric to keep from screaming. The smuggler had given Lee a new name and a date of birth to memorize. "You have no past," the smuggler instructed. "You are this person now." For a 7-year-old, the lesson was profound. Identity was not a truth, but a story you could adopt for survival. On the third day, the container was unloaded. When the doors finally screeched open, blinding California sunlight flooded in. Authorities were waiting. They had been tipped off. The 15 people, dehydrated and disoriented, were taken into custody. Because Lee was a minor and traveling alone, Lee was placed into the labyrinthine system of U.S. immigration custody for children. Lee spent 6 months in a government shelter, a place of clean walls, strict routines, and profound loneliness. Social workers asked questions Lee could not answer. Where were the parents? What was the real name? Lee gave the memorized name, the false birthday. The lie became a protective shell. Eventually, Lee was released to the distant cousin who signed sponsorship papers. Lee entered the American public school system as Lee, but with no birth certificate, no passport, no social security number. Lee was a ghost in the machinery of education. School was a daily exercise in invisibility. When forms asked for a social security number, Lee left them blank. Field trips requiring identification were skipped. The word illegal was never spoken to Lee's face, but it hung in the air, a barrier Lee learned to feel. Lee's only solace was the library, where books offered other worlds, where identity was fixed and knowable. Lee learned English with ferocious speed, not just to belong, but to master the language of the system that held so much power. Lee watched classmates plan for college, knowing that without a social security number, federal financial aid was impossible. The dream of higher education felt like a taunt. The undocumented child grows into an undocumented teenager, watching life happen from the other side of a glass wall. The turning point came at 19 in the form of Carlos, a classmate in a community college English class. Carlos was a US citizen, kind, persistent, and in love. Their relationship was genuine, built on study sessions and shared lunches. After 2 years, Carlos proposed marriage. For Lee, this was not a romantic fantasy, it was a legal lifeline. Marriage to a US citizen provides a pathway to a green card, but it is a path lined with scrutiny, suspicion, and profound emotional risk. They hired an immigration attorney and began the process. This meant exposing every secret. Lee had to confess the real story to Carlos, the container, the false name, the years of hiding. Carlos accepted it, but the US government would not be so forgiving. They had to prove their marriage was bona fide, real, not fraudulent for immigration purposes. The green card interview was held in a sterile federal building. The officer, behind thick glass, asked intimate, jarring questions. What side of the bed does your spouse sleep on? What did you have for breakfast last Tuesday? Who pays the electricity bill? Every answer was measured against evidence. Joint bank account statements, lease agreements, photos from vacations. The officer scrutinized Lee's history, focusing on the entry without inspection, the container. Because Lee was a minor at the time and had no criminal record, the officer exercised discretion. After an agonizing silence, the officer said, "We will recommend your case for approval." The relief was physical, a weight lifting. But it was not pure joy. It was the relief of a prisoner stepping into sunlight, squinting and uncertain. Lee received a conditional green card, valid for 2 years. The condition: prove the marriage was still real 2 years later. During those 2 years, Lee began volunteering at the very legal aid office that had helped with the case. Lee found a calling in translating complex legal language into simple, actionable steps for others. Lee enrolled in paralegal certification courses. When the condition was removed and Lee received a permanent green card, Lee was already working full-time as an immigration paralegal. Lee's specialty became marriage-based petitions and humanitarian visas, guiding others through the same terrifying interview room. Yet legal status did not erase the past. The child from the container still surfaces. Lee cannot tolerate small, dark spaces. Elevators are a challenge. The hum of a large engine can trigger a wave of anxiety. And there is a deeper wound, the loss of original identity. Lee has a US passport now, but it bears a name chosen by a smuggler. The name given by Lee's mother is a secret, a ghost in official records. Lee's mother died 3 years after Lee arrived in the US, still working in the garment factory, still in debt to the loan sharks. Lee could not return for the funeral. By the time the green card was secured, it was too late. The grief is not just for a person, but for a world that no longer exists and a self that was left behind in a dark, rolling sea. The lesson of Lee's story is about the cost of a legal identity. For many, papers come at the price of personal history. The system often requires immigrants to sanitize their pasts, to fit narratives of deservingness. It shows that childhood trauma does not end with adulthood or legal approval. It morphs. For the audience, Lee's journey underscores the impossible choices parents make and the long shadows they cast. It highlights the critical difference between being out of status as a child and choosing a path to legality as an adult, a process filled with vulnerability and sacrifice. It teaches that help is most powerful when it comes from those who have lived the maze. And it poses a haunting question. When you spend a lifetime learning a new name, who do you become? Lee's office today is filled with light, case files, and a small, framed photo of a woman, Lee's mother, smiling in front of the noodle shop. On the desk, beside the computer, sits a worn cloth doll, a silent witness to a journey from darkness to advocacy. Lee's story is the second door, a door that opened from the inside of a locked box, leading not to freedom, but to a lifelong fight to make other keys.